Okay, so let's get started. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to session 2 of the series. I think the series is going great. First session, great movie, great book. Same thing this week. I hope you're all enjoying it as much as I am. I know Mark is too. A quick reminder of two things. We will take care of comments and questions using the Q&A function at the bottom, and I'll relay them, Mark. The other thing, just as a note, the next session is in 3 weeks, but it is on a Thursday, not a Tuesday. We had to adjust the day of the week on one or two of these with Mark's schedule. So after tonight, we'll see you on Thursday, October 30. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark.
So let me do my usual but sincere thanks to Michael for his partnership, to the library, to the funders, to all of you who come again and again. I'm very grateful for that. Let me say also that Michael's being a little kind when he says that the asymmetrical schedule for this series was partly because of my schedule. It's also partly because Michael has so much programming going on at Wilton Library, to his credit, that we had to find dates that would work for both of us. I will say that for many years I have taught in libraries and sometimes in colleges an introduction to fiction called The Range of Realism, where the idea was how many different books would fit under the term of realistic fiction. And if you think about last time's book, Maltese Falcon, you would never mistake the style or atmosphere of that book for this one, Rebecca, even though they were published in the same decade. And you would never mistake either of these two books for the book we're doing next time, the sort of neo-Western, The Oxbow Incident from the 1940s. An excellent book, also an excellent movie. I'll say also that thanks to Michael's very good suggestion some months ago that I swap out a second Western for 2001: A Space Odyssey, we have an even greater survey of different kinds of realistic fiction. Science fiction is still realistic fiction. There's nothing in the science fiction of 2001 that wouldn't fit under realism. So let me say a few words about this remarkable book. It was published in 1938, so it's almost 90 years old. It has never been out of print, and it is one of the best-selling books of the 20th century. More impressive because it was written by a writer who, at the time it was published, was barely known, who was a lady, a dame. That is, she had married a lord, and that would not have made her more likely to be read by the reading public. But even though it channeled a little bit a kind of reworking of Jane Eyre, it has less in common with Jane Eyre than people think. It is a novel with an original plot from an unknown author, never been out of print, made into a great movie that was the first American movie that Alfred Hitchcock made when he emigrated to America and began a second career as a director here. And it won the Academy Award for Best Picture, which you may know. She had a number of other books that she wrote that were made into movies. Jamaica Inn, also directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The Birds, a short story, The Birds, directed by Hitchcock. And the story Don't Look Now, all horror or Gothic stories. So let me unpack Gothic a little bit. This kind of book is known as a Gothic novel. Gothic novels appeared in England at the end of the 18th century when their horror and fantastic plots were meant as a reaction to the ultra-reasonable Age of Enlightenment. People on the continent, and especially in England, were trying to suggest that the reasoning that was put forth by the members of the French Academy, by the founders of the American enterprise, we hold these truths to be self-evident, Thomas Paine's common sense. A number of artists and intellectuals were arguing, either in argument or in their literature, that a big part of the human experience, a big part of human nature, was the unreasonable, not sense, but nonsense and spookiness. And the Gothic novel came into being in the last decades of the 18th century. So Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, 1818, is an example of a Gothic novel. But the term Goth was coined in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, when the Renaissance writers believed that elegance, sophistication, and culture were the hallmarks of great art. And to make a contrast and to run down the literature and architecture that was created during the Middle Ages, they called that style Gothic, from the word Goth. The Goths were the tribes in Northern Europe, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, German or Germanic tribes that did not speak Latin, that did not shave, that did not wear togas, that did not hold Olympic Games, and didn't write any epics. From the point of view of the Romans and the later Renaissance people using the term, Goths were savages. They were barbarians. In fact, the word barbarian comes from the two syllables ba, where we get the word Babel and baby. Barbarians are people who don't speak a civilized language. They don't know Latin. So the word Goth in the Renaissance was a pejorative. But by the time we get to the end of the 18th century, in England, when people were hungry for some wackiness, some surreal literature, some scary literature of the kind that Frankenstein and later on Dracula would be, they recognized that the old Roman convents, Roman Catholic convents and monasteries that were no longer used because Henry VIII changed the national religion, they became kind of tombs, cemeteries, and scary places. And one of the hallmarks of Gothic literature is an affinity for Gothic architecture. It's a very rare Gothic novel, whether written in the 19th century, late 18th century, 19th century, or like this book, the 20th century, that did not focus on landscape and architecture. So it's a remarkable thing about human nature and human literature that you never have a haunted hardware store. There are no haunted barbershops or bowling alleys. There are no haunted CVSs. You may not have a good one, but they're not haunted. There are good reasons why the only kind of structure that typically is haunted is a house, is a home, or a former home. And these writers were fascinated by the idea that these empty monasteries, convents, which had a kind of spookiness because Roman Catholicism was thought to be a strange supernatural religion. They believed that the body and blood of Christ actually was part of the communion and so on. They did it not as anti religion, but to use what was around. And England's countryside was covered with abbeys and convents and cemeteries and churchyards that were in disrepair and became a breeding ground for stories about secret passages, dead babies buried that were given birth by nuns and buried in the basement of a convent, monasteries where the monks went mad or alcoholic, a lot of Protestant beating up on Roman Catholics for the sake of a good story. So a Gothic novel almost always is deeply connected to a sense of place. And we know that the first line, the famous first line of this novel, talks about Mandalay, the estate of Maxim de Winter, which is in the first and last scene of the book and is essentially another character in the novel. That is indisputable that this novel centers around that house as a place that's haunted, haunted by the memory of Rebecca, haunted by a disciple in Mrs. Danvers, who is clearly in love with the memory and perhaps was in love with the actual Mrs. Rebecca. It is telling that the narrator, the whole story is told from her point of view, which usually gives you more authority. The person who tells the story, the person who is essentially the author of the tale, usually has, by extension, the most authority. But this narrator is unnamed, which makes it hard to connect to her. And she is terrified, partly by her own sense of unworthiness, and partly because of how she's treated intentionally by Mrs. Danvers, who was the personal maid to Rebecca, and unintentionally, we think, by her husband. So Mandalay is a character in the book, and the issue cannot be resolved by figuring out what happened to Rebecca, by figuring out from a confession from Maxime what happened to Rebecca. It cannot be cleared by any kind of psychological or spiritual rebirth by the unnamed narrator. The only way a new life can begin is that Mandalay has to be erased, and it goes up in flames. Another affinity between Jane Eyre and this novel. So by the end of the book, the haunted house, if you will, is exorcised from the novel. I'll say a few more things before I turn it over to you. Gothic novels are filled with coincidences. So just when Mrs. Danvers is possibly being successful in convincing the narrator to jump to her suicide, we hear the sirens, which denote that Rebecca's boat has been found. Just that moment. And it's been found within a short distance from Mandalay, and we know what's happened in terms of their finding the body and that it elicits her confession from Maxime and so on. So the last thing I'll say about Mandalay is if you read any passage in which Mandalay is described in detail, like the opening passage, where she compares it to a picture postcard, you understand, certainly by the end of the novel, that Mandalay is not an old country estate with nobility and honor. Maxime tells his wife that it was done almost completely over by Rebecca. It was not something that belongs to his family. It's a different home completely. And we know that Rebecca had no tenderness, had no love, had no decency. She was a terrible person. It's not just that they didn't love each other. She was a terrible person, not a good wife, took lovers. She is the opposite of what the narrator believed her to be as a perfect wife. More than that, her husband did not love her and does not love her now. So, this idea that she thought she was marrying into a class system that was English and high-born turns out to be a sham. And the idea of theatricality runs everywhere through the novel. At one point, the narrator says it's like they were all on stage in some kind of show. They were just waiting for the curtain to go down so they could return to their dressing rooms. Not subtle. The ball that Mrs. Danvers tricks the narrator into doing to her regret is another idea of the theatricality. This is not the serious class English household manner that the narrator expected to find. It's not that those things that the reader of the novel expected to find. So Mandalay has to be removed from the earth for there to be healing, which we assume happened after the novel's over. And she began the novel, Daphne du Maurier, again, not well known at the time, when her husband, who served in the military, in the Air Force, and again, he was a lord, was stationed in Egypt. And she began writing the novel in Egypt when she was homesick for her own country estate in Cornwall, which is where Mandalay is set, the real countryside. And her longing for that actual classy ancestral home informs her love of Mandalay, of her own estate in her heart, but she was able to distance herself and make this a tawdry, hollow duplicate, a sham, for the purposes of the novel. People loved it for reasons you'll help me figure out when I ask you to comment, but in the same way that Downton Abbey was such a smash hit some time ago, what is it now, 40 years ago, whenever that was, people in America, many of them, love hearing about the British monarchy, love knowing about British royalty, and love stories about manor houses. Downton Abbey tapped into something in the American democratic consciousness that had nothing to do with democracy. And people read this book with the same eagerness to find out what was going on. What they got is a horror story where the old Gothic formula that desire is closely allied to terror. Wanting something badly, especially if it takes you out of your normal self, you can be mad with desire. There are two works of American drama that have desire in their title: Desire Under the Elms and Desire, Streetcar Named Desire. Desire is a big part of American culture. The Puritans settled the country, the Mayflower, because they knew desire was the enemy. Desire is the enemy of the soul. And yet, when the country was founded, it was originally going to be the basis of life, liberty, and property. The guarantee was life, liberty, and property. And people like Thomas Jefferson and others realized it would be embarrassing when that property included the living human beings. So he edited it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness is guaranteed to us. Not happiness, you're on your own, but you can pursue it. And what is the pursuit of happiness but another name for desire? So desire is a great motivator in American culture. I think it explains why this very British novel was so appealing to readers all over the globe, and especially Americans. It would not surprise me if some of you have read this novel more than once, and maybe way back in the day. I hope that's enough of a table setting that we can pause, and I'll let Michael take comments. I'm especially interested in hearing from people briefly, just because there are a lot of you who want to say something about your own experience reading or multiply reading or recently rereading the novel. We'll leave the movie for another day. The movie is good to see, but this is a lit series. So, Michael, I'll wait for you to take comments.
Okay, well, we've got one right off from Maria. Maria says, how woeful that in so many years of reading wonderful literature, I had not come across this book. I am indebted to you for introducing it to me, as I thought the writing was exceptional. Thanks so much for including it in this session. That said, I thought the choice in the movie of having Rebecca's death accidental instead of deliberate was a better one. It avoided a confused sympathy with the character of Maxime.
So let me say first, Maria, I thank you for your gratitude, and it warmed my heart because one of the things I do try to do in these library sessions that I can't always do in college courses or even in book groups that are private is introduce people to masterpieces that they might have missed. It's not just a spooky novel. It is a very well-written novel on the level of plot, on the level of the psychology revealed in the narrator, and especially in the writing. It's excellent writing, and I appreciate your appreciation of it.
Okay, folks, feel free to fill it in. I know, Mark, you wanted to concentrate. Oh, let's see. Do I have one here? Yes. Patricia says, I do think it's strange that the author lets the hero off with murder.
Yes. Well, Michael and I were talking in our virtual green room before we started that they had in the movie for the American code, because it was Alfred Hitchcock's first movie made in America, they had to make it that he did not kill his wife, because then he would have gotten off scot-free. The understanding is that cleansing of Mandalay means they're going to have a happy marriage after all, and that happy marriage is going to take place after the novel ends. So they fudged an ending to have the production code people be happy. Novels are not bound by the same production code because they're not going over governmentally licensed airwaves. It's very common for a lot of works, including the stories of the talented Mr. Ripley, Patricia Highsmith, and we're going to be reading one of her other novels, Strangers on a Train. It's very common for novels for people to literally get away with murder in the novel. Humphrey Bogart's character of Sam Spade won't let Miss Wonderly off, Bridget O'Brien won't let her off because he has a personal code. But American publishers would not have insisted that she go to jail or be executed. That was Dashiell Hammett. I wonder if anyone, whatever your relationship is to the novel, can say something about your own taste in what you might call Gothic or horror fiction, fiction that is creepy and horrible, not actual ghosts, but I think we have to agree you might rather see a ghost down the hallway than run into Mrs. Danvers on an October afternoon. Very creepy role, brilliantly played by Judith Anderson, who won an Academy Award for the role, and a great conception of having a lady's maid clearly have a non-standard in the day, sexual, spiritual, psychological adoration of her former mistress, and you sense it only got magnified after Rebecca died, but was certainly part of the dynamic of how she served her. And when she's quite serious about why not end your unhappiness by throwing yourself out the window, we recognize that a great deal of our unhappiness is not just the brutality. I mean, think about telling her to dress up as the first Mrs. De Winter at the ball, and the cruelty that goes into the sadism that goes into that. That's a scary lady, and yet she's presented realistically as someone who, through her jealousy, hates the unnamed narrator, and maybe her husband too. Anyone want to volunteer comments about how you found the novel as a horror story?
Well, Janet's got a comment, and she says, the movie lingers strongly in my mind because of the supernatural effects and the mystery of Rebecca, which grow in the novel.
Yes. And again, I think not just people at the end of the Enlightenment, but people in all countries and all places, especially nations like ours, that pride itself on being based on rational principles. You know, we have a Declaration of Independence. We have one of the first constitutions, not the first, but one of the first. And I think most people in America think the American democracy is largely based on rational and even scientific principles, one person, one vote, those kinds of things. The kind of formula, whether you like it or not, that goes into the Electoral College. It's not a country that was founded on whim, but there's a great appeal for people who are bred on such a system of culture, who are bred to live rationally, to have an experience of irrationality in their movies, in their novels. And it's not always Stephen King, a good example of a 20th century and now 21st century Gothic writer, but other kinds of writers, including women. And in fact, there is a subcategory of Gothic fiction that is called the female Gothic or women's Gothic, which is where the horror story is what women have to confront in the novel. You may think it's also in real life. That's a debate for another day, of what they have to do to compromise their independence by marrying, even if they make a good marriage. And the fear in these novels that such women have that they will lose themselves by being overwhelmed by the identity of their husband, by the husband's family name, which they almost always have to take, by the husband's status in society. He clearly is a different class than the narrator, clearly a different class, and that the subgenre of the female Gothic is a psychological fear, not a horror story, but a psychological fear can breed horror, a kind of terror, that to be married is to lose your identity as a person because you're losing your identity as a woman. That might be something some of you want to comment on, whether you're confessional or not. If you're in the meeting room with your husband next to you, you can ask him to leave if you like. But I invite you to try to think of ways to talk about this book that I'm suggesting if you haven't come up with more yourself.
Okay, Patricia says, the story, The Yellow Wallpaper, seems an extreme version of what you are talking about.
Yes, this is a short story at the turn of the century. Someone help remind me of the excellent author's name. I'm blanking on her name. The Yellow Wallpaper. Anyway, a major short story writer in American fiction, known for several short stories, but mainly for The Yellow Wallpaper. Could the person who named that title contribute the name of the author? I like to give people credit for the works they write. While we're waiting, I will tell you that today I was speaking to a colleague of mine who is 33 years old. I say her age because she hasn't experienced the sexism that I've seen in my life, even though she's a female, in her shorter life. And we were talking about the fact that women are more conscious of the etiquette, the courtesy, the humanity of making sure that people get introduced and accounted for. And I told her that in my many years at Yale, at least a dozen times, maybe more, I would meet the father of one of my students, often at graduation, who would nicely want to introduce himself to me as the dean of the college and introduce his wife to me as the father of their son or daughter. And very often, at least 15 or 20 times, the father would say, Dean Schenker, I'm Tony Shapiro, I'm Bob's father. I want to thank you for all you've done, and I'd like to introduce my wife, period. And a gesture towards the woman standing mutely at his side. I'd like to introduce my wife with this weak gesture and no name. I have never had a female, a parent, a mother, an aunt, a female, ever do the same thing with her husband. But men will introduce their wife by the relationship as if she's chattel and not realize how inhumane that is. And I think you see that kind of thing all the time. And a lot of energy goes into families when there are issues about marriage and who's taking whose name and what it means to lose your father's name because you now have to take on your husband's name. It's not a minor point for many people.
So just to tie up a loose end, the author there is Charlotte Perkins Gilman.
I knew it was renamed like Sarah Orange Jewett, but I couldn't remember. Thank you, whoever came up with that. I recommend that story to you. Another story about the female condition and the psychological duress that it can cause.
And Maria's got a follow-up comment. I thought it was a great choice of the authors to have the complete opposition of hearing Rebecca's name many, many, many times in the novel and in the title, of course, and never hearing the name of the narrator.
Yes, who made that comment, Michael?
Maria.
Marie?
Maria.
Maria, kudos to you again. That's an excellent insight, and I'll take it one step further. It's not just that we hear Rebecca's name countlessly. She sees Rebecca's name written in script with the slanted R. And that matters because a written name has a kind of talismanic quality. It becomes an artifact. And I'm sure there are women in this room who sometime in their life were practicing the writing of their first name with possible surnames, whether it was the last name of a boy you liked in middle school or high school or college or when you were an adult. I can't be the only person who has family members who practice writing their name or a signature as Mary Phillips or whatever it might be. That idea that she sees Rebecca's name in writing and that it's not just a name orally, that is AUR, being heard, but a name as an artifact matters a great deal. And it gives it another kind of quality. You may know that the reason spell, SPELL, in the sense of spelling a word, and the same spelling and pronunciation for casting some kind of spell over someone are the same word because it was believed you could only cast a spell if you knew the words. If you didn't know the right words for the incantation, it wouldn't work. The magic depended on language because there's a long history of language being connected to magic. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. That is, God's power to speak becomes his magic. I'm not being disrespectful, his creation. And Adam is favored by being permitted to name the animals to show that he is Lord over them. Language, speech matters. In fact, our word glamour for a kind of charisma now associated mainly with women and fashion and Hollywood. But glamour in the Middle Ages was charisma, was power. And it actually is a corruption of the word grammar because it was believed that the people, mainly men, who studied Latin and knew their grammar had charisma, had a certain kind of power. So there's a long connection between the spoken and written word and a kind of magic. And I think it's an excellent point, Maria, that we hear one name constantly and the other name not at all. It's very hard to have a sense of her if we don't know her name. We're used to having characters in novels have names, and especially narrators. Call Me Ishmael. Huckleberry Finn begins, You don't know anything about me unless you read a novel by Mark Twain called Tom Sawyer. People name themselves. Nick Carraway introduces himself by name at the beginning of his narration. Holden Caulfield, the same. Names matter, and we don't know her name.
Okay, we'll see if we get any more. Oh, here's a comment. It's more of a quick comment about another book, maybe in this type of a genre. Janet's saying that Henry James' The Turn of the Screw is a brilliant supernatural story.
Yes, Henry James, who was one of the more sophisticated American writers living and writing in England, wrote a number of ghost stories, including The Turn of the Screw, which is utterly to be explained in psychological, realistic, social explanation. that these apparent ghosts that people are seeing don't actually exist, and that the story is narrated by an unnamed nanny who is letting her fear and youth get the best of her. And it's a really creepy story. The turn of the screw refers to the fact that the tension in the story keeps getting ratcheted up and gets more and more unnerving. You can also explain the story by believing that the two children who seem to be ghosts are actually ghosts. And part of the brilliance of the story is you can have it both ways without having to decide. And it's one of these stories where the narrator may be an unreliable narrator. And the question becomes, did these two dead servants do something unspeakable with the children? And because it's a Victorian era novel, roughly, it always has to do with sex. And so the unspoken trauma of these children is that this male and female servants somehow abused these young children. It was made into a splendid movie with Deborah Carr, who is brilliant as the governess. I recommend the story to you. Michael Redgrave has an important part. The children, I don't know the actors, are brilliant. The two actors who play the dead villains, if they're villains, are also well cast. Very, very creepy story. And his point about writing a ghost story when he is known to write high society novels is that ghost stories are an important part of human civilization. And the more civilized, the more you need ghost stories. That it's not something primitive or old fashioned, it's something that is in everyday life.
Okay, comment from Kate, who says, I seem to recall in the novel that Mrs. Danvers says Rebecca should have been born a boy. I wonder if some of the Gothic aspect of this novel is that it's a cautionary tale about the extreme life Rebecca led as a woman. Would a man who behaved the same way be judged in the same way?
Yeah, it's a good question. What's the name of that contributor?
Kate.
Thank you, Kate. So I'll say this to amplify, not to undo anything you said. What made Jane Eyre famous in its day, and there are similarities between Jane Eyre and this novel, but they've been overdone by many critics. The psychosexual characterization of Mrs. Danvers, the fact that there is a Mrs. Danvers, and Jane Eyre is very importantly named in the book. She has the name of a common woman, Jane, and she has one of the most common names in England. Eyre is a name like Miller or Smith. And famously, she tells her own story with her name, goes through a Dickensian childhood and is badly treated. And finally, when she is almost duped into being married to a man already married, and you can see the affinity there, Mr. Rochester of Thornfield Hall almost dupes Jane Eyre into marrying him, even though his first wife is alive and demented upstairs, the mad woman in the attic, sometimes referred to. She's saved from that by running off to leave Rochester and go to a man she admires but does not love named St. John Rivers, who's going to do missionary work abroad. And he wants her to go with him as his wife. And she will go with him to serve him, but not as his wife. And when she's preparing to go, she hears Rochester, this Byronic hero, by which we mean attractive, but dark and brooding and dangerous, a bad boy. She hears Rochester, the upper class lord of this hall, call her name out in the middle of the night. Janet, Janet, little Jane, Janet. She goes running back to Thornfield Hall and finds that the hall has been burned down, a la Manderley, by a fire unintentionally or intentionally set by the first wife. And in the fire, the first wife has died. In the fire, much of the house and certainly the attic has been destroyed. In the fire, Rochester has lost the use of his right arm, which is clearly Freudian, and has partly been blinded. That is, this bad boy who did a bad thing has been punished and neutered, except he recovers enough of his manhood or testosterone that when they marry, in the famous line, "Reader, I married him," and if you read the novel, you remember that line, and the right way to read it is, "Reader, I married him." That is, I, Jane Eyre, am swimming against the tide, and I chose my husband, even in this mid 19th century Victorian novel. And she says that she doesn't have the heart to tell him that the reason she came back is that she heard him cry out in the middle of the night, because he says to her, "Janet, I called to you one evening. I know it was insane, but I hoped you would hear me." And the novel is dead serious that it resolves its plot by telepathy. By telepathy. There's a good Jeopardy question. And she says, "I didn't have the heart to tell him in his weakened condition that I actually heard his voice. I'll wait till he's better and I'll share it with him." And the narrator says, "I tucked these things in my heart," which is the line of what Mary, the Virgin Mother of God, says when she's told she's going to be the Mother of God. Mary tucks these things in her heart. No English reader of any religious background, any Christian background, would fail to recognize that Jane Eyre, who marries her husband, not the other way around, is so empowered that she speaks in the language of the Madonna. That's a long winded way of saying there's nothing in this novel that compares to the female empowerment of Jane Eyre. It is a novel of education, it is a novel of coming of age where it happens to a woman when women were not the subject of coming of age novels. Huck Finn, Holden Caulfield, all the boys who grow up to be men are boys and men and not women. So it's very different from Jane Eyre, even though it has some affinities.
So we have a comment from Liz. Despite all of the supernatural, the real pivot point in power seems to occur when the narrator learns that her husband never loved Rebecca and that the field was clear for her own relationship with him. After that, the balloon of Rebecca's power deflates, albeit dramatically given the destruction of Manderley.
Yeah, I think this is my friend Liz Salazzo, so thank you, Liz.
Yep.
I happen to know she's a married woman, so I'll say that one of the things about the novel that I think many readers, male and female, single or married, respond to is there's a great mystery in marriage. There's a great mystery in other people's marriages, especially if the marriage seems asymmetrical, a much older and a much younger person, a much higher socioeconomic class and a lower class. There's a great mystery in other people's marriages about what do they see in each other? How do they stay together? I think every married couple in this Zoom room, and maybe a lot of single people, have had that conversation with their mate or a close friend in trying to solve the mystery of how certain people of your acquaintance are married. Some of you may have had that conversation about your own marriage, and I'm not making a joke. One of the things the novel plays on is that this originally seemed a perfect marriage. He seemed like a good guy. And then it seemed like a nightmare marriage because of how Rebecca was not the person she seemed to be. And then when the confession comes that they hated each other and that Maxine was murderous, you get a sense that things are not as they seem. And then the question is it possible that getting rid of Mandalay, getting rid of the ghost of Rebecca, having a confessional cleansing by Maxine, the story he tells, is that enough to guarantee that the new marriage will be good? And you notice the novel sidesteps that completely. They're driving down the road. They see the blaze in the distance. Mandalay is gone. It reverses the beginning of the novel where they're approaching, or not the beginning of the novel, but early in the novel where they're approaching Mandalay. And you can read it as you like, but the suggestion is they have a fresh start. But it does raise the question of the mystery of marriage.
All right. Well, right now we have gone through all the questions that were there so far.
Can I ask you for a time check, Michael?
It's 10 to 8.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to say there is a class of fiction called a marriage novel. Many novels are examinations, expositions of marriages. And it is not only something that's common to many people and cultures, but it makes for a good plot, especially if the narrator of the marriage novel is one part of a couple. Um, since I have the time, I'll remind you, as always, that if you have questions after this session ends that you think I might answer, knowing that I'm not an expert on Daphne du Maurier, and I'd prefer to have questions that are about the novel and not the movie or life in general. If you can look it up on Wikipedia, do yourself and me a favor and ask that question about whether or not Daphne du Maurier has suffered from X, Y, or Z. But I will answer questions soon after I get them. Let me spend a little bit of time talking about how different the realism is in the Oxbow incident. I'm going to assume that very few of you, unless you're fans of Western writing, have read the novel The Oxbow Incident. Many more of you likely saw the excellent movie where the two men who are at the center of the crisis, these two cowboys who wander into a crisis of a lynch mob, are played by Henry Fonda and Henry Morgan, the fellow who played Colonel Potter on MASH. You know him from that mainly, but he was a character actor. And Anthony Quinn is in that movie as well. It's called The Oxbow Incident, the first novel written by its writer, Walter von Tilburg Clark, because there is a tree that dominates the landscape in the novel, which is basically a one scene movie, a one scene novel. There are other scenes, but few. Is shaped like an oxbow. That is, it has two branches that move in different directions that have a curve, a double curve, the way an oxbow has a curve on the left and a curve on the right to fit over the shoulders of each of the two oxen. And the tree, which has no leaves on it, is this weird shape that looks like an oxbow. It's a marker in the landscape of the terrain, and it dominates the scene of the movie. I will not summarize the plot for you, but it is a plot that talks about personal morality and public lynch mob justice, which is not unknown as a staple of Western literature. But it is so impressively done. Dana Andrews also has a very significant part in the movie. And just as I was talking about Rebecca's name being written, and you may remember that when Huckleberry Finn decides that he doesn't want to be a bad boy anymore, that he doesn't want to be associated with letting an escaped slave escape, he decides that he wants to be good, and he writes a note to Miss Watson, the owner of Jim, to say that he's going to turn Jim in, and before they go any farther, they're going to pull over, and he's going to turn Jim in, even though he loves Jim. He's going to do what he thinks is the right thing. It's the right thing because his conscience has been deformed by Southern slave owners' mentality. And he writes the note and he gives it a couple of minutes thought and he decides to rip it up and says, "That's all right, I'll go to hell," because he knows that he'd rather go to hell, which he thinks he will because he thinks what he's doing is a terrible sin, because he loves Jim. And the fact that he does the right thing for the wrong reason is Mark Twain's way of saying, look at how screwed up this boy is because of where he was bred. But my point is, Mark Twain, a brilliant writer, does not have Huck decide to do it and then reverse it, does not change his mind. He has Huck write the letter, an artifact like Rebecca's signature, and then rip it up, which makes it so much more moral, so much more courageous. Write it down, be on the brink of doing this terrible thing that you shouldn't do, rip it up. That's something that we see again and again. Well, in the movie, The Oxbow Incident, Dana Andrews in the movie plays the part of the novel of a man who fears he's going to be executed for a crime he didn't commit, and he decides to write a letter to his wife explaining his circumstances, and he entrusts the letter to the care of one of the men who has not taken an extreme position on the issue. I'm trying to not spoil any plot for you. That letter is a magnificent document, and it's in the book and it's in the movie. If you like the book, I recommend the movie. It's a short movie, excellent performances by all the actors I've named. Jane Caldwell, who played the mother in Grapes of Wrath, has the only significant, maybe the only female part in the movie. She's worth mentioning as well. So, a Western, radically different from either of the first two sessions we've had. And again, I'm thinking of the range of realism. How many different kinds of stories can be told that still comport with our notion that this is possible? So, Michael, that should bring us to the end of the hour, I think.
Pretty close. If you want, I've got a couple of other comments that came in while you were talking.
I got nowhere to go.
The first one is from an anonymous person, and it says, I see some similarity between Rebecca and Jane Eyre in terms of the reversal of man-wife power dynamics. The novel Rebecca starts off with the second Mrs. De Winter as a caretaker of Max, while Jane Eyre ends with Jane taking care of Rochester.
A good point. And I wonder if this anonymous contributor has an affinity to the anonymous narrator of the book, but I'll leave that for another day. You have another one, Michael. You said.
I have one more, and Maria's got another follow-up. It says, memory plays an interesting role in this story. In many ways, not only the obvious memories of Rebecca. One example that was notable to me was that at the beginning, she is talking about being in this unremarkable hotel in an effort to forget, but all she does is continue to reminisce. She's relating to us the very things that she claims that she wants to forget.
Right. Maria, thank you again for another comment, and I'll footnote to this my unanswered question earlier. Notice she's not living in her employer's house. They're living in a hotel that is a non-home. And the answer to my question, why are there no haunted bowling alleys or CVSs or barbershops, is because you can only have a haunting in a building that had people living in it as a home. Only homes like Poltergeist or any of the many horror stories, Psycho, the only way buildings get haunted, largely, there are always going to be some exceptions, is because what's brooding in the house is ancestral or familial or marital or filial or parental tensions that are what Freud knew was the birth of trauma. Only homes get perverted into scary places. And part of what's significant about the early pages of Rebecca is that her work that she's doing for her employer, she's not staying in a home, it's a hotel. So I thank you for your attention and the contributions. I do think this is a good series because of the books, not because of me. And in every instance, I commend to you to see the movie if you haven't seen it in whatever order you want. I think most every one of the movies made from the book is an extraordinarily good movie. You could argue that Old Man and the Sea doesn't ride to the same level as a movie, and I'll explain why when we get to it. But it's certainly worth reading that book and seeing the movie. So next time, Michael reminds you, not the usual day. I will see you and thank Michael again for his partnership and wish you all a good few weeks ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, everybody. Great comments, great contributions. And yeah, so we'll see you in a few weeks on Thursday, October 30. Take care, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you. Good night, all.